Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for this summer's inaugural Survivor Speaker Talk. Today we will hear from Magie Furst, who was on the Kindertransport as a child and became a refugee and ultimately made it to the United States. She will tell you her story in just a moment, but what I would like to do before we get to that is to thank our Summer Survivor Speaker Series sponsor, the Ernst & Young LLP, and I would also like to thank our community partners for this series, Avance, North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Today you will be able to hear Ms. Furst give her testimony of her experiences. She'll speak for about 45 minutes or so. And then after that, we will open to questions and answers from you all. And there should be a question and answer note or icon at the bottom of your screen that you can click and put your questions into. There's also a chat icon at the bottom of your screen, so either one of those would be fine, and we'll bring those questions up then when we get to the question and answer period. And now I will leave you to hear from Miss Magie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages. My name is Magie Furst. I was born in Germany in 1929. I have been an American Jew for the last 70 years. Jews have lived in Germany since Roman times. The Jewish population in Germany was well integrated by the end of the 19th century. Until the rise of Nazism, Jews were part of the mainstream. Jews were professors at universities, lawyers, doctors, writers, and scientists. Many of the department stores had Jewish owners as well as the banks. Mixed marriages were common. In general, the Jewish community consisted of Reform Jews, although there were some Orthodox congregations. Our father, Alfred Romberg, was born in Diepholz, Germany, a small town not far from Essen. He was one of 13 children. Obviously, that was before television. His parents were Frederica and Julius Romberg, my paternal grandparents. Our mother, Sitte Rothschild, was born to Katinka and Benjamin Rothschild in the village of Astheim, Germany, not far from Mainz. And Mainz is famous for the Gutenberg Bible. My mother was one of 4 children. Our dad fought for the Germans in the First World War. He was wounded and awarded the Iron Cross, the highest medal given. When he met our mother, he was a handsome young bank officer in Essen. They fell in love and married in 1927. They lived in Astheim in our grandparents' house. He joined the family business and became co-owner upon the death of my grandfather in 1929. He took over the successful grain, feed, and general merchandise store. I was born in 1929, and my brother Bert was born in 1930. In 1933, after Hitler came to power, our dad was harassed endlessly by stormtroopers who marched in front of our house and business day and night, shouting Nazi slogans, causing him great distress, which eventually killed him. He had a fatal heart attack in March of 1934. At that time, I was 4.5 years old, and Bert was 3.5 years old. Mama never got over our father's death. In fact, I found some old newspapers she had saved, which describes the funeral cortege moving through the village. Stones and insults were thrown at the mourners. I started school in Astheim, and as far as I can remember, I was well treated by my schoolmates. We also played behind closed doors with our neighbors' children. These same neighbors supplied us with food, such as milk, butter, and other essentials, through a common basement wall into which we had made a hole. They supported us through many trials, as they had in years past. We had a teenager named Elizabeth, whom we called Leah, who took care of us while Mama and our Oma worked in the store. Mama struggled along to keep the business afloat, but as the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws were passed, the farmers no longer paid their debt to Jews. She was forced to sell the business for a pittance. In 1936, we moved to Eschwege, near Kassel, with a good-sized Jewish population for moral support. My Aunt Paula lived there with her family. We tried to overcome the adverse conditions. Mama had to take in laundry and sewing to support us. She was ordered to go to Gestapo headquarters and hand over all our valuables. That included everything that we owned, whether it was good linens, china, silver, jewelry, diamonds, bank accounts, everything was taken. Also, at this time, all Jews got new names. The men all got the name of Israel, which was long before the state of Israel was established. And the women all got the name of Sarah. And then we had to find an apartment. After 3 tries, we finally found an apartment that was Jewish-owned, which we shared with another Jewish family. We were unable to attend secular schools and had to attend a Jewish school. The trouble was we were all in one classroom, so you can imagine how much we learned. Well, the first thing I did when I got to school in the morning is I ate my lunch sandwich to fortify myself for the day's hard work, which consisted of playing hide and seek, and the teachers had very little control over us. After Kristallnacht, there was no school, nor was there a synagogue to attend. It was November the 9th, 1938. Everything that was Jewish-owned was burned, destroyed, or in ruins. Houses were ransacked. Jewish men and teenagers were dragged off to newly established concentration camps. Our cousin Henry, 14 and a half, was dragged off across the town square. By December the 13th, 1938, Jewish industries and shops were seized. Living conditions in Eschwege went from bad to grave. We could not go out without being beaten up by the Hitler Youth. Actually, when we went out, for instance, to get a loaf of bread or something like that, I used to stand in front of my brother Bert so they would beat me up first. Some of the men were eventually released from the concentration camps in terrible physical conditions. Some came home in urns. Most of them tried to leave the country to whomever would take them in, but many had no means or guarantor and despaired, often committing suicide. We are convinced that Mama made a decision after Kristallnacht that she could no longer risk her children's lives in Nazi Germany. Our father had a sister and her family living in Stockholm since 1928. Mama appealed to them for a visa for Bert and for myself. Following Kristallnacht and appeals by Jewish committees and a debate in Parliament, the British government agreed to admit up to 10,000 children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Austria had been overrun by the Nazis in 1938, and also part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. A £50 bond per child was posted to guarantee their eventual fare to some other country. The British wanted to take care of us, but not forever. The British Inter-Aid Committee was established. Their goal was to rescue 50,000 children. They were mostly Jewish, but there were some non-Aryan Christian children, and they were in danger too. Parliament passed an emergency measure to permit these children to enter the United Kingdom. The conditions were they had to be potty trained, alone, under 17 years of age, and only 2 per family, which was a great dilemma. They figured it would cost a minimum of £25 per year to maintain each child. That was a lot of money at that time, because most of the people that volunteers to take these children were ordinary families that didn't have anything to spare at the end of the week. The British people came forth and opened their hearts and homes. Only 9,354 children were actually saved, usually rounded out to 10,000. The first transport of 196 children were from a Jewish orphanage in Berlin on December the 2nd, 1938. That was barely 1 month since Kristallnacht. So they didn't mess around. They got right to work. The last transport left with a Dutch Christian lady, 25 years old. Her name was Trudy Rosmiller. She faced down Eichmann in Vienna and brought out 600 children on one train. My brother and I received our visas to go to Sweden 3 days before my mom got permission from her cousins in London to work in the household, the Lowenthals, who had emigrated to Great Britain in 1934. They were instrumental in getting her out and getting us onto the Kindertransport instead of going to Sweden. We were overjoyed that we could all be in Great Britain. I've got to have a drink of water. Excuse me 1 minute. Of course, saying goodbye to all our relatives was very sad. My grandmother was only 69 years old the last time I saw her. She went to the old age home in Frankfurt, and from there she was deported. She had always been part of our lives, as well as all our other relatives. We left with one small suitcase each, about the size you take onto Southwest Airlines, which is not very big, and little kids can't carry big suitcases. The night before we left, I cleaned out my suitcase and threw my underwear away and put my dolly in there. That was a lot more important than my underwear. All the clothes we wore were made by mother and grandmother. At that time, we couldn't buy anything anymore in the stores, so they tore the old clothes apart and remade them into new ones. We had 10 marks we could take out of the country. Even in those days, that wasn't much money. We had little else with us. The scene at the railway station wasn't very happy, as you can imagine. Some parents held on to their children and didn't want to let them go. Others ran off without saying goodbye. Some didn't even come to the train. Most of the children were not as upset as the parents. After all, this was a big adventure. I thought I was going on a holiday on a big island, and I was going to dig in the sand and lie in the sun and just have a great time. Well, the train went forward with a lurch, and we were on our way. I can't remember too much about the train ride, except when it suddenly stopped, I heard the Gestapo boots coming into our compartment. Looking into our suitcases, they screamed at us, "You Jewish dogs, do you have any diamonds?" We would have been insane to have any contraband with us. Besides, I doubt if there were any Jews left in Germany in 1939 who still had diamonds. And if they did, they weren't going to put it in a child's suitcase. Finally, we continued on and crossed the border into Holland. And you could see the difference already. The people in the fields were waving, and they looked happy. The first stop we came to, there were smiling Dutch angels handing us hot chocolate and fruit that we hadn't seen for many years. And some of us, I had never seen it. The Jews were not allowed to buy any tropical fruits such as oranges and bananas or any vegetables that were not grown in Germany. I had my first orange in Holland, and I got a big hug, and no one spat in our faces. The train continued on to Hoek van Holland to Port for Rotterdam. We boarded a little ship and crossed the English Channel at night. We arrived in Harwich on the East Coast early in the morning. It was a glorious, bright, sunshiny English day, May 23rd, 1939. We were directed to another train bound for Liverpool Street Station in London. Mama's cousins picked us up in a beautiful new car. As soon as we were on the way, my brother Bert threw up on the cousin's wife's new shoes. That was our introduction to Great Britain. The next shock came as the uncle announced that he was bankrupt and had sold the house. But Mama could stay and work for the new owners, who were due to arrive from Vienna next week. After a few weeks, Mama had a nervous breakdown. But she persevered and came through it. What could she do? She had no money. She couldn't go back to Germany. And she certainly wasn't going to leave her children. So even if she crawled on all fours, she worked. And she eventually made it through. Another dilemma, Bert and I had no lodgings. Uncle knew the president of the Coventry Synagogue, and between the two of them, they found homes for 55 children. Bert was eventually sent to the Shepherds. There was Mom and Pop, Peter their son, and Mary their daughter. They called him Bertie, the same as the then King George. Pop was a mailman, and Mom became a bus conductor at the onset of war. The Simons, where I went to live, were Jewish and better off financially than the Shepherds, but treated me very shabbily. I became a cheap maid. Bert and I lived only a few blocks apart. We went to the same school, where we saw each other only during class breaks or the Hebrew school once a week. I had to cook and clean when I came home from school, and 10 years old, I was not very adept in the kitchen. Actually, I was a pretty good cook. I was very consistent. I burnt the meat every day. To correct it, I took newspapers, put them on the floor, and then I turned the pot upside down, scraped the black off the meat, and put it back in the same burnt pot again, not knowing that using the same burnt pot didn't improve the taste. Anyway, they ate it. Now, either they had no taste buds or they were stupid or both. In school, I was not too happy either. My English was not too swift as yet. Luckily for me, there was a Jewish teacher, a Mrs. Jacobs, who took me under her wing. The headmistress's name was Miss Smith, and try as I might, it came out as Miss, to the delight of the other children. And the more they laughed, the more I cried. I adapted to my new surroundings by the time the war broke out, and on September the 3rd, 1939, I spoke no more German. I wouldn't have dared. The English hated the Boche. That was a hangover from the French from the First World War. I was able to speak English in 3 months, and I had nobody to speak German to, so that was very good, very easy to learn. No such thing as English as a second language. My unhappiness with the Simon family wasn't helped by the fact that I was a scapegoat for their children's misbehavior. John teased me incessantly. Esther and I shared one bed, which he wet every night. So I took my pillow and wrapped myself in my coat and slept on the floor. English houses are very cold. And even today, they do not warm them up the way we do in the wintertime. So it was better to sleep on a cold floor than in a wet bed. As the war progressed, the English needed factory workers. Mama found a factory job. Now she could support herself and rented rooms with 3 other refugee friends. But she still did not have enough money to support Bert and myself. She took in work at night and saved enough money to dream about going to the United States. What a dream. Mama showed me 2 telegrams she received from the Swiss Red Cross. She had asked about our relatives. They came back as undeliverable. I knew that she was worried, but in my childish way, I assured her the British would work hard to help everybody, and they really tried very, very hard. They were alone in that terrible war from September the 1st, 1939, until December the 7th, 1941. Bert and I went to visit Mama whenever we had a school break, despite the fact that the bombing had started. We were so happy when we were together. When it came time to go back to Coventry, as soon as the train started to move, Bert started to cry, and I, the brave one, started to cry with him all the way back. Coventry was a favorite target of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. They were aiming for the Triumph Motor Works and the Jaguar plant, which had converted to war weapons. But instead, they destroyed the center of the city, including the centuries-old cathedral. Then they came back a week later and finished it off. That was November the 14th, 1940. There were many casualties. The destruction was devastating. All communication in and out of the city were cut, but the British kept a stiff upper lip. The Simon's house was damaged the first time around, and we had evacuated to a small village near Banbury in the vicinity of Oxford. Finally, the Red Cross were able to connect us to each other, our mother in London and Bert in the damaged house in Coventry. The conditions we were living under only made my distaste for Mr. Simon more pronounced. He was an abuser, and I was petrified, but had no escape. My writing paper, my only means of communication with my mother, and my stamps had mysteriously disappeared. I had to wait until we went to London again. Then I did not go back to the Simons. Mama went to the Bloomsbury House, an affiliation of HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who were there to help the refugees. Between the two of them, they found me a wonderful boarding school, which had been evacuated to Hertfordshire, near Cambridge, from London. I finally started to blossom and live like a human being. The school was situated on an estate belonging to a British colonel fighting in North Africa. He had loaned the estate to the London County Council for the duration of the war. The teachers were like mothers to us. We were 36 girls. 2 of us were Jewish, and 2 of us were from the Spanish Civil War. I was well treated and didn't mind doing my share to keep the house and grounds in good shape. I took care of Alma the goat. Alma and I had a good relationship. We talked to each other. Although she smelled like a goat, I didn't care. I was happy. And now you all go home and get rid of your dog and get yourself a goat. The dog doesn't mow the lawn. The goat will. You don't have to take the goat every week to the vet. The goat will give you the most wonderful milk and cheese you've ever had. Best of all, you won't have to pick after the goat every day because you can use the droppings in your garden. In the meantime, Bert was sent to a warm and loving family in Hartford, not far from me. Mama was afraid he might be converted, and it was time for his bar mitzvah. He went to live with the Pettit family. They were extraordinary people. Mrs. Pettit slept on the floor when our mother came to visit to get some respite from the bombing. I was only able to stay in school until I was 14 and a half years old. The school was not equipped to teach beyond that age. Unless you had a scholarship or money, you went to work. There was a war to be won, and school was not the English priority at this time. I returned to London and went to work for a dentist. The first day on the job, I cleaned up glass from a bomb which had fallen on the commons, the field across from the office. Every night when the sirens went off, we went to the air raid shelter, except me. Nothing was going to hurt me. One night, the ceiling caved in and the windows flew in, and I came very close to being cut very badly. After that, I was the first one in the air raid shelter every night. Well, we played around in the shelter all night long, and we didn't sleep, but we were safe. On June the 5th, 1944, it was D-Day, and the invasion of Europe had begun under General Dwight Eisenhower. Mama started to inquire if we could go to the United States. Eventually, we did get our visas, even though the war was still on. It was a hard decision for Mama to make because of Bert's education. He had won a scholarship for Cambridge University, which would have taken care of his education all the way through his PhD, room and board, and all expenses paid. But she decided we would all have a better chance in the United States. We left Britain with heavy hearts the beginning of April 1945 on the old Aquitania, which had been converted to a Canadian hospital ship. We sailed from Brennich, Scotland to Halifax, Nova Scotia. From there, we traveled by train to Montreal, St. Albans, Vermont to New York City. It was April the 12th, 1945, a day before President Roosevelt died. The war was in its final stages in Europe. Mama's sister, brother, and their families welcomed us very warmly. The British were wonderful to us. We shall always be indebted to them for their indomitable spirit, their kindness and compassion. They saved our lives and those of many others. No other country in the world would take in Jewish refugees. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. A few countries made it a little bit easier, such as Chile, Costa Rica, and the Belgian Congo. Even in this country, it was hard to get in. President Roosevelt had some members in his cabinet who did not want Jews. There was no place for them to go when the Holocaust started, the greatest tragedy that ever befell the Jewish people. Some of the children that arrived on the Kindertransport were picked up by various agencies and placed in hostels. The younger ones went to families. Some of the older ones were taken in as household help or nannies. Others were placed with many loving families all over the British Isles. They went to England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Some adjusted very well. Others had a hard time being torn away from their families. The younger ones forgot their parents very quickly. Some were converted to Christianity or were adopted by families who grew to love them as much or more than their own children. As they became older, some joined the armed forces and fought valiantly. Some fell in battle. Some joined the Jewish Brigade. After the war, a few were reunited with their families or siblings, but most of the uniting was very strained and difficult. The children had not seen their parents for at least 6 years. The parents had unspeakable horrors to deal with. Many had psychological or mental problems, could never get used to each other again. The children had also acquired a different culture and way of life. Most of the children never saw their dear ones again. All those who were left behind perished. In the summer of 1989, there was a 50-year reunion in London, which we attended. We were addressed by many dignitaries. Amongst them was Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. Of course, there were countless ordinary people who gave us love and shelter. The Kindertransport is but a small part of Holocaust history, but an important one. We were the ones to whom nothing happened at all, but something did happen. We were spared the horrors of the camps. We were uprooted, transported to a different culture, and faced not the horrors of the camps, but a very human mixture of kindness, indifference, occasional exploitation, and the selflessness of ordinary people faced with needy children. Many British values have stayed with us. Fair play comes to mind, and that's not cricket. We need to defend the helpless and stand our ground. Don't give in to bullies. Be kind to all people. Be sure to help your parents and your grandparents. Do some volunteer work, and whenever you can, save your money, give some to the Red Cross or the American Heart Association or any worthy cause. You can go to the food bank and make some sandwiches. This applies to all the teenagers and to the older people too. There are many homeless in our communities. Most of all work hard in school. If you don't get it the first time, try again and again until you do get it. Read as much as you can. It's very important that you do well in school. I can't emphasize that enough. Become active and don't be afraid to speak up. You know, if you say something out of place, the teacher will tell you. I had to go back to school when I came to New York. I went to Jamaica High School, and then I went to Queens College at night. And I had to work because we had no money. In 1948, I met my husband at the beach in Far Rockaway. We married in 1949. Our children were born in New York, and we came to Dallas in 1963. My husband was also a refugee child, but he was lucky enough to come to the beautiful country in 1937 with his parents. He went through the New York City schools. He was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1943 when he was 19. First he was a dishwasher, a medic, and then he became a translator for General Patton. When he went into Germany, and then he went into Germany. And I have 2 wonderful grandchildren. Now I have 3 because one of them is married. I've been volunteering for the museum for about 18 years. I also did volunteer work for the Dallas County Probate Court, for people who are under guardianship, and for the Vogel Alcove, which is a daycare center for children of the homeless. I make meals for people who are ill when I have time. I knit for cancer patients and for the homeless. I read a lot. I belong to a book club. I go to Torah study at my synagogue every Saturday. At least I did until the coronavirus hit us. I'm very interested in the symphony and in all the museums in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Above all, I always make time for my grandchildren and for all children. And now I'll answer some of your questions.
Maggie?
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, wonderful. So this is Sarah Abosh Jacobson. You can't see me, but I'm going to ask questions today. So the first question is, would you tell me, please, what you want people, especially young people, to learn from your story?
What do you want them to carry out from our story? I want them to be open-minded and make room in their hearts for everybody, no matter who it is, what religion they are, what color they are, and work hard in school. That's very important.
Okay. Maggie, Katie O'Brien wants to know, what was it like coming to America for the first time?
What was it like coming to America from Great Britain? Well, it was a whole different world for me. You know, going from Germany to Great Britain, and then, well, of course, I was 6 years older then. I was almost 16 when we came to America. And I went back to school, and the school system here is completely different than the one in Great Britain. And it was very hard for me. I was wonderful. I did not have to take any English. I skipped all my English classes. But I had a very hard time with math and all the sciences. And that was very taxing on my spirit.
Maggie, what happened to your mother?
I can't hear you.
What happened to your mother?
My mother came to the United States with us. She even came to Dallas with us. And she lived until 1974 here, and she died at 76. And she was a wonderful, wonderful person.
Maggie, did people, when you got to England, ask you about whether you had experienced anything under the Nazis, or did they question whether you were loyal to Britain or loyal to the Nazis? What was that like?
Nobody ever asked me anything about Germany. Neither did they question my loyalty. They did, however, do that to people that were older. Some of them were interned in camps. My mother had to go before a tribunal in London and swear that she was not a Nazi.
Maggie, what was your religious practice like in Britain? Did you go to synagogue? Were you involved in any Jewish youth groups or anything like that?
We went to religious classes at the synagogue in Coventry. Of course, once we left Coventry, that was the end of that. But when I was finished with the boarding school, I went back to London. I joined a young Jewish group, like a Zionist group, in London.
Okay. Maggie, Kamala Timalshina wants to know if you have a particular favorite memory from your childhood that you really cherish, that makes you happy, that makes you feel good.
From my childhood, you mean in Germany yet? I imagine that's what you mean.
I think in Germany or in Britain or maybe in both.
In Germany, we had very good neighbors. We were very close to them. They had children. We played together. We were very carefree. You know, we really actually, at that age, we really didn't know what was going on. We didn't pay any attention to it because, you know, children, it's like a duck in water. It flows off their backs. They take everything for granted. Had a very happy childhood.
Okay. Maggie, Marcia, and Joe Zimmerman just say that they're here watching today and listening, and they love you very much. So I just thought I'd share that.
Marcia,
and we
who?
love you too. Marcia and Joe Zimmerman.
Oh my goodness me, my old friends.
Okay. Tim Lorsch asks if you've ever been back to Germany, and if you have, what was that experience like?
We've been back to Germany 3 times. The first time, I was very reluctant. We went to Israel first, and we went with El Al, and we landed in Frankfurt, and when I put my foot on the ground, I felt like I wanted to go back into the plane. But everybody was very kind. Last year, my children took me on a trip down the Danube for my 90th birthday, and that was unbelievable. We met my husband's cousins in Frankfurt. We met my cousins from my side of the family, and we had a wonderful time together. They are Jewish, but they were raised as Jews in Germany. And I found that the German people were warmer and more welcoming than anywhere else we went in Europe.
Maggie, Amy Both, who calls you Aunt Maggie, wants to know if you had to change your last name to protect yourself and your family at any point during your travels.
No.
Okay. And Celeste Montelongo wants to know how you've taught your children and your grandchildren about your experiences and what you lived through.
Well, my son didn't want to know anything about Germany. He didn't want us to speak German at all. And right after the war, nobody wanted to buy German products, not German cars or anything. That took a few years to materialize. My daughter was a little bit more lenient, maybe because she was younger, that she didn't fully get the impact of it. But it was hard. It was very hard. It took a number of years before anybody would even talk about anything that happened in Germany or all the horror they created.
Okay. Maggie, Jessica Torres asks a question about whether everything going on in our country today relating to racial tensions takes you back or brings back memories of your time between 1933 and 1938, 39 in Germany.
It certainly does. Unfortunately, I am not in tune with our administration, and I think it's frightening that the head of our government reminds me so much of when Hitler started out.
Okay. Maggie, what would you like students to know about the Holocaust? This is from Maria Castaneda.
I think they should know everything about it. Why were the people deported? Why were they put to death? Why? Simply because of their religion. It doesn't matter who it was. There were 1.5 million children died in this horror. Just imagine, babies. It's just too awful to think about.
Maggie, do you ever read books about the Holocaust?
Do I what?
Read books about the Holocaust.
Yes, I do.
And are there any in particular that you might recommend for people to look at that struck you or that you thought were very, very good?
Well, I'm just reading about the Ritchie boys, about Camp Ritchie. And my brother-in-law, my husband's brother, was a Ritchie boy. And so was one of our late speakers here at the museum, Rudy Baum. And there are many interesting stories about this group of people, and it's interesting to read. And I also remember all the battles during the war and everything, so I know what they're talking about, and all the generals. And so I can't put the book down. I just finished it.
Are you talking, Maggie, about Bruce Henderson's book, Sons and Soldiers?
Yes.
Okay, so the museum is going to be doing a book talk about that, and you're right, it's an absolutely wonderful book. For anybody who's interested, it's by Bruce Henderson, Henderson. It's called Sons and Soldiers, and it is about German Jewish and Austrian Jewish young men who had emigrated to the United States with their families before World War II broke out, and then were recruited by the U.S. military to go back as American soldiers during D-Day and serve as intelligence officers and interrogators in the field. A very interesting book. Okay, Maggie, before we finish, I wanted to again thank our sponsor and our supporters and also our members for joining us today. And Maggie, do you have any final words you want to share with us before we log off for this session?
Well, I'd love to do this again if anybody that's interested.
Okay, that's wonderful to hear. And just so everybody with us right now knows, we will be doing this another 8 times this summer. So a couple of times this month, 3 times in July, and then again 3 times in August as part of our summer Survivor and Second Generation Survivor Speaker Series. Thank you so much for joining us live today from the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and we wish you a safe and happy afternoon.
Yes.